Welcome to the Human Footprint in the American West, an EcoWest.org presentation. EcoWest's mission is to inform and advance conservation in the American West by analyzing, visualizing, and sharing data on environmental trends. This is one of 6 presentations that illustrate key environmental metrics. Libraries for each topic contain additional slides. You can download these presentations at EcoWest.org. Let's begin with the table of contents for this slide deck. First, we discuss the lay of the land and who owns the West. Next, we discuss the various ways in which the human footprint has been manifest in the region. We move on to growth and housing, land trusts that seek to conserve private land, ranching, agriculture, mining, forestry, and various forms of energy development. Here are the key points. The West is dominated by federal land, with national forests, common and mountainous terrain, and BLM land prevalent in lower elevation areas, but some of the most biologically diverse areas are privately owned. Although much of the West is publicly owned, the human footprint is evident almost everywhere in the region. Relatively pristine areas are often protected as wilderness or national parks, but many undeveloped areas remain vulnerable. The West accounts for a rising share of the nation's population, with most growth occurring in and around big cities in an increasingly urbanized region. The number of land trusts and the acres they protect continues to increase, as does accreditation of these nonprofits, but the level of activity varies widely from state to state. Some traditional economic sectors, such as logging on public lands, are in decline, but the West is still home to important mines, farms, rangeland, and other working landscapes. The West is playing an increasingly important role in the nation's fossil and renewable energy supply, but development of natural gas, solar, wind, and other sources often comes into conflict with protections for wildlife and other natural resources. Let's begin by getting oriented and understanding the lay of the land in the West. The preponderance of public land is one of the West's defining features. This graphic shows that nearly half of the 11 western states are owned by the federal government. The biggest landowner in the West is the Bureau of Land Management, followed by the Forest Service. Outside of the West and Alaska, there is very little federal land in other states. This graphic shows how land use and land type differ according to the owner. Virtually all cropland, for instance, is privately owned. Public land, whether owned by the federal, state, or other form of government, tends to have a mix of land types. Federal lands in the West include undeveloped parks and wilderness areas, rangeland grazed by livestock, national forests that may or may not be logged, and a variety of other land uses. This map shows what percentage of each state is owned by the federal government. Trust lands, mostly Indian reservations, are not included. Nevada and Alaska top the list, and all western states have at least 30% of their land under federal control. Back east, New Hampshire, Vermont, and of course the District of Columbia have the most federal land. Here we see all of the states that have at least 10% of land owned by the federal government. Western states are at the top, but it's worth noting that the rate of federal ownership varies from around 30% in Montana and Washington to nearly 85% in Nevada. Let's take a closer look at the mosaic of land ownership and land uses in the West and elsewhere. The black on this map shows urbanized areas. You can see that there are far more big cities back east, but the West certainly has its share, especially along and near the Pacific coast. In the eastern half of the country, the bulk of the land is unprotected and privately owned. There's also plenty of that in the West in places like the Central Valley in California, southeast Washington, and eastern Montana. But especially in the inland West, much of the land is either federal, state, or tribal. Let's start filling in more landowners, beginning with a couple of minor players, such as parcels that have a variety of owners, depicted here in pink. There are also some private lands dedicated to conservation, seen here in yellow. They're typically smaller parcels and scattered, so they don't show up well on a national map, but these lands are critical to conservation, and we return to them in our discussion of land trusts. Orange represents local or regional land agencies, such as those run by cities or counties. Now let's start talking about some of the major players. Especially in the West, but also in some parts of the upper Midwest and Northeast, a fair amount of land is controlled by state governments. Out west, these acres were generally given to the states by the federal government when territories entered the Union, and typically states are supposed to raise money for their public schools by selling some of these lands to the highest bidder. But the parcels tend to be scattered and intermixed with federal lands. Tribal land covers large parts of Arizona and New Mexico, and it's found in every western state. But the biggest player is clearly the federal government. Within all of that green, there are many different agencies in charge of how the land is managed, and each has its own mission and mandate. Let's take a closer look at how federal land breaks down. Military training and weapons experiments take place on lands controlled by the Departments of Defense and Energy. Some of these places, such as the fabled Area 51 in southern Nevada, are top secret, but portions of others, such as the Barry M. Goldwater bombing range in southwest Arizona, are open to recreational users who get a special permit. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of the Interior Department, manages some very sizable national wildlife refuges, often to benefit endangered species and waterfowl. Our national parks protect some of the nation's most spectacular scenery and ecosystems. Many of the mountainous areas of the West are under the purview of the Forest Service, although there are also some national forests back east. But the biggest federal landowner is the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, which controls many of the lower elevation federal lands that lie in the basins between the mountains. All of those federal agencies grant varying levels of protection to the land they manage, with traditional industries such as logging, mining, and ranching allowed in many areas, but prohibited in many wilderness areas, parks, and other preserves. But something like a housing development, shopping mall, or farm isn't allowed on federal land, and one of the most striking features of the West is that a relatively large portion of the region enjoys some form of protected status. Most of the West's ecoregions, areas that are like ecological neighborhoods, have at least 20% of their area protected, reflecting the predominance of public lands in these inland arid areas. The rate is somewhat lower along the California coast and in the plains east of the Rocky Mountains. Very little land is protected in California's Central Valley and Oregon's Willamette Valley. Although much of the West land is protected in some manner, the imprint of humanity on the region has been deep and indelible. This map shows the results of an analysis of the human footprint in the West that accounts for a variety of stressors. White indicates areas with the least human impact, followed by green for places where the footprint is minimal, while orange and red areas are where people have done the most to transform native ecosystems. The most heavily impacted areas tend to be near cities, with places like Southern California, the Bay Area, Puget Sound, and the Colorado Front Range showing up clearly. Agriculture is the other big driver here. The Central Valley of California, the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and parts of southeast Washington and southern Idaho stand out in this regard. Many of the white and deep green areas on the map are already protected as wilderness areas, usually in national forests or national parks, but sometimes on land managed by the BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service. Blue indicates the location of wilderness areas in places such as the Sierra Nevada, Mojave Desert, Northern Cascades, and Northern Rockies. Here are where national parks and monuments are located. Major parks such as Yellowstone, Glacier, Death Valley, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Canyonlands, and Olympic are clearly visible. And here are the so-called Wilderness Study Areas, or WSAs, which the BLM is currently managing as wilderness, but which are not protected by an act of Congress. You can see that these wilderness areas, parks, monuments, and WSAs cover many of the white areas, but not all of them. Most of the other areas that are white or deep green on these maps are public lands, but they are not receiving the special protections afforded to wilderness and parks. Even land that is ostensibly public, such as the millions of acres of state school trust land in the West, may be vulnerable to development because state governments fund their educational systems through the sale and lease of such parcels. Let's take a closer look at some of the factors used to calculate the human footprint in the West. Planners now talk about the age of megacities in the West, and you can see them on this map. The vast majority of the region's population lives in and around a dozen or so cities. San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Portland, and Seattle on the Pacific coast have some of the biggest cities. But inland there's also Las Vegas, the Phoenix-Tucson corridor, Santa Fe and Albuquerque, Salt Lake City on Utah's Wasatch Front, and the string of cities along the Colorado Front Range, from Fort Collins to Boulder to Denver to Colorado Springs. It's actually farming that has the greatest imprint on the West in terms of acres affected. Vast areas without many people have been transformed by agriculture, usually with the aid of irrigation. Even areas that aren't cities, suburbs, or farms have been impacted by the far-reaching network of highways and roads that crisscross the West. It's worth noting that this map shows just major highways. The vast network of secondary and dirt roads also contributes to habitat fragmentation. The authors of this analysis also looked at other networks, such as rail lines, which may be fenced and create obstacles for wildlife. Power lines, which often require roads underneath, also provide places for avian predators to perch. Canals can also fragment habitat. And even things like landfills, which can attract ravens, rats, and other species that imperil native wildlife. Another human impact are wildfires caused by people. As you can see, there have been thousands and thousands of these fires, some of which have grown to hundreds of thousands of acres. This map takes all of the points shown in the previous slide and shows where the density of human-caused fires is greatest. Places with relatively few residents, such as the Sierra Nevada, the Cascade Mountains, and the Mogollon Rim of Arizona, have seen plenty of human-caused wildfires. Even very remote places bear the marks of human activity. Oil and gas drilling, plus the associated network of roads, pipelines, and other infrastructure, have made a significant impact on very unpopulated parts of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. This map, however, does not account for more recent oil and gas drilling in other parts of the West. One final category of human-caused stressors to discuss is invasive species. This map shows the risk of invasion by exotic plants and is based on factors such as roads, which are conducive to spreading these alien invaders. This analysis also looked at non-native animals, namely feral cats and feral dogs, both of which tend to be found near where people live. Add it all up, and you've got this portrait of the human footprint in the American West. As with so many other dimensions, elevation, rainfall, temperature, the West is a study in contrasts and diversity. Let's take a closer look at some of the factors behind this expanding human imprint. We begin with perhaps the most important one, population growth. Since the middle of the 19th century, Western states have accounted for an increasing share of the U.S. population. By 2030, the region is expected to be home to a quarter of all Americans, up from about 0% in 1830 and 9% in 1930. California has obviously been the biggest driver of population growth in the West, and it totally dwarfs the other states. That's expected to continue in the decades to come. If you take California out of the picture, it's easier to see the other western states. Some, such as Wyoming and Montana, aren't growing all that fast, but others, such as Arizona and Nevada, are booming and expected to keep growing in the foreseeable future. This graphic illustrates America's westward migration by showing the mean center of population from 1790 to 2010. The center is the place where an imaginary, flat, weightless, and rigid map of the United States would balance perfectly if all residents were of identical weight. Since the first census in 1790, the nation's population has moved westward, and in more recent decades towards the south, reflecting the booming population growth in the Sun Belt. Focusing on recent growth, you can see in this map that the West is home to some of the fastest growing counties in the country. This slide shows the change in the number of people living in each county from the 2000 to 2010 census. Growth was especially strong in places like Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Southern California, the Colorado Front Range, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Portland, Seattle, and Salt Lake City. This map shows the percentage change by county. While the West has some counties that increased in population by more than 50%, places like Pinal County in Arizona between Phoenix and Tucson, and Washington County, Utah, home to St. George, there are some parts of the West that are losing residents, such as the eastern portions of Oregon, Montana, and Colorado. This map illustrates that the West's population is very concentrated and urbanized. The diamonds are sized according to a county's population, and you can see how the cities of Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, the Inland Empire, really dominate. Add in the Bay Area, Portland, Seattle, Spokane, Boise, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, El Paso, and Denver, and you've accounted for the vast majority of people living west of the 100th meridian. Now let's talk about land trusts, an important part of conservation in the West and other regions. These nonprofit organizations work with private landowners to protect important habitat and open space, often by creating conservation easements that perpetually prevent harmful development on the property. In the slides that follow, we discuss findings of a census conducted every 5 years by the Land Trust Alliance. First, let's take a look at conservation easements, the bread and butter of land trusts. Easements permanently protect private land, but sometimes they allow limited housing, water use, and other development. This map shows the location of easements around the country, but because the parcels tend to be small and scattered, it's hard to see them on a national map. If we zoom into a place like Colorado, the easements are much easier to make out. And here's Montana. By the end of 2010, land trusts had conserved some 47 million acres, an area more than double the size of all the national parks in the contiguous United States. The acreage has increased by 10 million acres since 2005, and it has increased by more than 100% since 2000, when 23 million acres were protected. Land trusts use a variety of methods to protect land, including buying property outright, managing conservation easements, or helping other organizations acquire properties or enact deed restrictions. This graphic shows that easements, which generally cost much less than purchases, have been making up an increasing share of the activity of state and local land trusts. Land trusts are found in virtually every state, but the highest concentrations are in California, the Northeast, and Upper Midwest. In the West, Colorado and Washington each have more than 36 land trusts, but many inland states such as Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico have fewer than 10. This map shows the change in the number of land trusts from 2000 to 2010. You can see that California was far and away the leader, with 65 new land trusts created. Arizona gained 12 in the first decade of the 21st century, while Oregon and Washington each added 8. Now let's turn from the number of land trusts to the acres they protect. Once again, California leads the nation with more than 2.3 million acres protected. Out west, Colorado and Montana have protected more than 1 million acres. Back east, Maine, New York, and Virginia have the most acreage protected by land trusts. The figures in the preceding slide show raw acreage totals, but this map displays what percent of each state is protected by land trusts. Using this measure, many smaller Northeast states stand out. In Vermont, 10% of the state is protected by land trusts. In Maine, it's 8%. Out west, where many states are dominated by federal land, the figures are much lower, with California and Colorado leading the way at about 2%. How has the acreage protected changed over the past decade? The greatest increase was in Maine, where nearly 1.7 million acres were added. Out west, California, Colorado, and Montana saw the biggest rise. Land trusts come in all shapes and sizes, but there is a growing movement in the field to accredit the organizations so they are following best practices for finance and governance. Since 2008, more than 135 land trusts have been accredited. About 2/3 of land trusts that are eligible but haven't yet applied for accreditation say they are planning to do so. This graphic shows that accredited land trusts only account for about 1/8 of the acres protected, but a current applicant for accreditation, the Nature Conservancy, makes up about 1/3 of the total acres. Many of the accredited land trusts are found in the West, with California, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada leading the way in the region. Now let's take a look at one of the dominant land uses in the West, livestock ranching. The federal government owns 42% of the land in the West, and about 85% of federal land is grazed. This map illustrates where livestock grazing is concentrated in the U.S. The colors show the percent of each county that is cattle, pasture, or rangeland, with red indicating the highest percentages. Each dot represents 10,000 cattle. Although livestock production occurs in every state, it's definitely most common in the nation's midsection. Out west, the eastern portions of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico have lots of rangeland. But the black dots indicate that there are plenty of cows found elsewhere, including very hot and dry locations like Arizona and Southern California. As you might expect, places like Vermont, home to Ben & Jerry's, and Wisconsin, home of the Cheeseheads, have lots of dairy cattle. Out west, some of the greatest concentrations are found in the Central Valley of California, southern Idaho, and in central Arizona. Beef cows are more widely distributed throughout the country in the West, but the greatest concentration is found in the nation's midsection. The BLM and Forest Service oversee about 30,000 grazing permits. Who are these ranchers? This graphic shows that they're hardly monolithic. In this study, researchers classified federal grazing permittees into 8 categories. About half are considered professional ranchers and half are part-time ranchers. The professional ranchers range from corporate operations to solo operators who are dependent on ranching for their income, while part-time ranchers range from relatively affluent trophy ranchers who engage in the activity as a tax shelter or for the lifestyle, to retired part-time ranchers who may be struggling economically. Let's take a closer look at these various types of ranchers. The first section of this table is based on responses to a survey that asked ranchers why they do what they do. In general, ranchers say the most important factors are the tradition, values, culture, and the opportunity to raise their family in a good location. Profit ranks lower, and with good reason. It's tough to make a lot of money as a public lands rancher. The second section of this table shows the various sources of income for each type of rancher. For trophy ranchers, livestock only account for about 20% of their income, while investments made up 41%. But for dependent family ranchers, livestock account for 85% of their income and investments only account for about 1%. The last line shows that net income is about $94,000 for trophy ranchers, but just $47,000 for the dependent family ranchers. These various types of ranchers also run very different kinds of operations. Trophy and corporate ranchers have the most deeded land and cows, but they differ in experience, with the former in the business for 13 years on average, and the latter working in ranching for an average of 33 years. One dimension that's similar across the groups is age. The youngest average is 51 years old, and some groups have an average age in the 60s. Because ranchers tend to be older, there are questions about what will happen to the industry and the land it occupies as these grazing permittees retire or die, often without the ability to pass on their ranch to younger generations. In some places, ranchers leaving the business are opting to subdivide and sell their deeded acres in response to development pressures. Now let's talk about the broader agricultural sector and its place in the West. This map from the 2007 Census of Agriculture shows the number of acres and farms in 2007. Farms are found throughout the country, but they are most heavily concentrated in the Midwest. Here's how the acreage changed from the previous census in 2002. In many parts of the West, such as Wyoming, Utah, and California, there were considerable decreases. Nationally, there was a net decrease of about 16 million acres. West of the 100th meridian is where you'll find the most irrigation in the United States, although there is still some irrigation along the Mississippi River and even in relatively wet places like Florida. Out west, large-scale irrigation is common in places like eastern Washington, the Central Valley of California, and along the Snake River in Idaho. Here's how the number of irrigated acres changed from 2002 to 2007. You can see that in just 5 years there were major increases and decreases throughout the nation due to changing weather and commodity markets. California saw a major decrease, while places like Colorado and Nebraska saw big increases. Here's another way of looking at the agricultural data. This map shows what percent of the land area in each county is farmland. In the nation's midsection, many counties in the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas have more than 90% of their land devoted to farms. Out west, the percentages are generally much lower, but there are some counties in places like eastern Washington and the Central Valley that are dominated by agriculture. If you look at the value of the crops sold, you can see that many parts of the West show up even more distinctly. This is because higher value crops, such as fruits and vegetables, rather than soybeans and corn, are grown in some parts of the West. This map shows that grains, oilseeds, and similar commodities dominate in the Midwest and the Missouri River watershed. In the West, there's also plenty of wheat farming in places like Montana and Washington State. Vegetables, melons, potatoes, and the like play a much bigger role in the agricultural economy of the West, as do fruits, nuts, and berries. Here's another summary view where vegetables are harvested and the land that's devoted to orchards. A row of crops is hardly a native ecosystem, but farms do sometimes qualify as open space, and sometimes they provide valuable wildlife habitat. This graphic shows how much agricultural land was developed from 1982 to 2007. Some western states, such as California, Arizona, and Colorado, show up near the top of the list for number of acres converted. But that's partly due to their large size. Western states are much lower down on the list when you look at the percentage of each state's agricultural land that was converted from 1982 to 2007. In many western states, agricultural land is naturally limited by the preponderance of federal land and the lack of water. A broader category, rural land, shows a similar pattern. On an acreage basis, California, Arizona, Washington, and Colorado are in the top half for the 50 states, but states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia actually lost more farmland. And because so much rural land in western states is federally owned and thereby protected from housing and commercial development, western states have lost a lower percentage of their rural land, especially compared to some smaller states in the Northeast like New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. This map shows what parts of the country are considered high-quality farmland and whether they are at risk from development. Red shows high-quality farmland with high development potential, and green shows high-quality farmland with low development potential. Now let's talk about another industry that has figured prominently in the West's history for centuries. It was the prospect of finding gold, silver, and other minerals that drew early explorers like Coronado to the region in the 16th century, and it was the discovery of gold in California that helped spark a huge westward migration. This map shows the location of active mines and processing plants in the United States. You can see that they're pretty well scattered throughout the country. Most of these sites mine or process sand, gravel, or crushed stone. They're shown in red on this map. As you might imagine, things like sand, gravel, and stone are relatively common, and they're needed in lots of basic applications, such as construction and landscaping. So the activity is distributed throughout the country. This is also an expensive product to transport. You wouldn't want to have to import boulders from across the country. Specific minerals like copper are found in just a few locations, shown here as orange dots. Now you know why Arizona is known as the Copper State. Aside from a couple of copper mines in Missouri and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all are located in the Intermountain West. This map shows where silver mines are located, and why Nevada is called the Silver State. As with copper, most of the nation's silver mines are located in the West. Same goes for gold, which is often found in association with silver. Mining activity is highly dependent on commodity prices. This slide shows how prices for three key minerals in the American West have changed over the past decade. Now let's take a look at another industry as old as the West itself, forestry. The region's high country forests have been subject to logging for more than a century, but the industry has been changing. This map shows what percentage of each ecoregion is covered with forest habitat. You can see that the Great Plains and southwestern deserts have very little land that is forested, but even some hot, arid ecoregions such as the Great Basin in Nevada and the mountains of central Utah and central Arizona have their share of forests at higher elevations. The most heavily forested part of the region is in the Pacific Northwest, but the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountains also have considerable forest resources. Debates about forest management in the West used to focus on commercial logging, but the industry is a shadow of its former self. This graphic shows how much timber was sold and harvested on national forests starting at the inception of the Forest Service in 1905. The lines sometimes diverge because timber may be sold in one year but harvested in another year. There was a big run-up in the post-war era, but then a dramatic decline started in the late 1980s as restrictions related to the spotted owl and other environmental laws took effect, and foreign competition hurt the industry. As a result, many timber mills were closed around the West, so it can be a struggle now to find facilities to handle trees that are cut as part of fuels reductions projects, especially because most of the trees being removed are small diameter and not what the mills were built to handle. This map shows the value of timber cut in national forests in 2010. You can see that national forests back east are some of the biggest producers. In the west, the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies are the most active, followed by the Sierra Nevada. There's very little logging on national forests elsewhere in the region. Here is the same data shown by state and by U.S. Forest Service region. In the West, national forests in Oregon and Washington remain the most productive for timber. Now let's talk about another important sector. Both of these pie charts show U.S. energy consumption in 2011. On the left, the energy is divided by its source. You can see that about 83% of the total comes from fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal. Nuclear accounts for 9%, while biomass and other renewable fuels account for 8%. On the right, energy consumption is broken down by economic sector. Transportation and industry account for about 30% each. Residential use amounts to about a quarter, and commercial use is about 1/5. How have these energy sources changed over time? This time series shows that fossil fuels have always dominated the energy sector, and that renewables still haven't made much of a dent. Biomass accounts for about half of all renewable sources. Here's how the sector-by-sector breakdown has changed over time. Industrial energy use has been more variable than other sectors, and it has recently leveled off, but consumption in the other three sectors has continued to rise along with the nation's population. Energy use varies widely from state to state. The top graphic shows the total consumption, and this is largely a function of a state's population. The bottom graphic shows per capita consumption, with western states in orange. On a per capita basis, some sparsely populated western states are near the top, while the region's biggest state, California, is near the bottom. Here's the same data in a map. The states that use the most energy per person, such as Alaska, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Louisiana, are also major energy producers, and they have small populations. Energy prices also vary dramatically across the country. This map shows that states in the Northeast tend to have the highest prices, along with the D.C. area, Florida, Nevada, and Arizona. This graphic shows that there is an inverse relationship between energy prices and energy consumption across the 50 U.S. states. Now let's shift to a slightly different way of looking at the energy sector: how much energy the U.S. produces. Once again, fossil fuels continue to dominate, and renewables have only increased slightly. Currently, oil, coal, and natural gas account for about 78% of the energy we produce, and nuclear is a little over 10%. Renewables account for about 1/8 of the nation's power portfolio, and about half of that is from biomass. Hydropower accounts for 4%, and wind makes up 1.5%. Solar and geothermal combined account for about 1/2 of 1%. Nuclear power had been increasing in the 1960s and 1970s, but the 3 Mile Island disaster led to more than 3 decades without any new plants being built in the United States. Coal continues to dominate the nation's power portfolio, but natural gas is making steady gains as the price of that fuel decreases and environmental regulations make it harder to burn coal. In this graphic, we see that renewable energy actually accounted for a greater share of the nation's portfolio in the 1940s and 1950s, but that wasn't due to primitive solar panels or wind turbines. In that era, lots of people were still burning wood, a renewable resource, to make energy. For much of the 20th century, coal was the preferred fuel for new generating capacity. We also added hydropower by building major dams. But more recently, natural gas has been the favored fuel. It's been decades since a new nuclear plant has been built, but wind has been making some gains in the past few years. This graphic looks into the future. Over the next 25 years, natural gas is expected to be the main fuel for new generating capacity, but renewables are also projected to make some inroads. The cost of the various energy options plays a major role in the decisions that utilities and state regulators make about building new power plants. This graphic shows the overall cost for 16 different technologies. The cheapest 2 options at the bottom use natural gas, but renewable resources such as wind and geothermal aren't too far behind. Solar energy technologies are currently the most expensive. But while natural gas plants may be the favored choice for new generation, that doesn't mean coal-fired power plants won't still be around. Although many coal plants have been shut down and others are expected to be retired or shuttered in the years to come, plenty will still be operating decades from now, and coal is still expected to be the dominant source for U.S. energy production in 2035. A major reason why natural gas is becoming the favored choice for new generating capacity is that vast quantities are being unlocked with new technologies. This diagram shows the various types of gas and associated fuels. Techniques such as fracking, in which water, sand, and chemicals are injected underground to release gas, and horizontal drilling, which allows drilling for deposits without being directly above them, are dramatically increasing natural gas production. Until a few years ago, shale gas was a minor player, but by 2035, it's expected to account for about half of the nation's natural gas production, as conventional gas deposits decline in significance. Conventional gas deposits are found throughout the country and offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, but in the West, these deposits tend to be concentrated in a few locations, including the Colorado Plateau, Wyoming, Montana, and northeast Colorado. Shale gas is found in some of the same locations as conventional deposits. In the West, that includes the Four Corners states, Wyoming, Montana, and Southern California. Nearly all parts of the country are expected to see more drilling for natural gas, but the biggest increases are projected to occur in the Northeast, as shale gas deposits there are developed. Natural gas development in the West takes place on private, tribal, state, and federal lands. Over time, federal lands have become increasingly important to the nation's energy supply. This graphic shows that federal lands now account for about a third of the total for natural gas and all fossil fuels. The rate of energy development on public lands was a point of contention in the 2012 presidential election. This graphic shows that sales of fossil fuels produced on federal and Indian lands has remained relatively constant over the last decade, although natural gas sales have declined slightly. Environmental regulations play a role in determining energy activity on public lands, but so do economic variables such as commodity prices. This graphic focuses on natural gas. The decline was actually due to less offshore activity, in large part due to the fallout from the BP disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, while onshore natural gas production on federal and Indian lands has actually seen a slight upward trend. Let's take a closer look at renewables. This graphic shows that Americans are consuming more and more power generated from renewable sources, but the bulk is from hydropower and wood. Wind and biofuels are increasing, but solar remains a very minor player. Looking ahead, energy analysts believe that wind will be the biggest gainer among renewables, but solar is expected to make some strides. This graphic shows that wind power capacity has been increasing rapidly in recent years, up more than 11-fold between 2001 and 2011. The best wind power potential is off the nation's coastline and in the middle of the country. In the 11 western states, onshore wind power potential is greatest east of the Continental Divide, in places like southeastern Wyoming and the eastern portions of Montana, Colorado, and New Mexico. This map shows that wind power is found in many locations throughout the West, especially California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. One of the major issues confronting wind power developers in places like Wyoming and Montana is the presence of the greater sage grouse, an imperiled bird that is a candidate for protection under the Endangered Species Act. This map shows the bird's current and historic range. Solar energy is also becoming more widespread. This graphic shows that some of the biggest additions in the past few years have been in utility-scale projects, but residential installations are also on the rise. Solar energy potential is greatest in the Southwest, but many other parts of the West also have decent solar resources available. This map shows the potential for solar photovoltaic panels. A major issue in the deployment of solar energy in the Southwest is the presence of another imperiled animal, the Mojave subspecies of desert tortoise, which is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This map shows the location of desert tortoise critical habitat in purple. The desert tortoise was one of the main issues that federal officials, environmentalists, and energy developers confronted when trying to decide where to build major solar facilities in the Southwest. This map shows the location of the federal solar energy zones that emerged from a multi-year planning process overseen by the BLM. Although wind and solar have a number of environmental advantages, they do tend to take up more space than coal and natural gas power plants. This analysis examined the issue of energy sprawl and concluded that biofuels have by far the biggest footprint of energy sources because it takes so much land to grow the necessary crops. It's also worth remembering that the best way to shrink the energy sector's footprint is to reduce energy demand through efficiency measures. The analysis of energy sprawl also looked at which types of habitat would be impacted by various types of energy development. This table shows that biofuels affect the greatest acreage, and most of that is in temperate deciduous forests in the nation's midsection. Corn-based ethanol is a major component of the biofuels piece, and this map shows that the fuel is primarily grown and processed in the upper Midwest. Let's review some of the main conclusions. Although much of the West is publicly owned, the level of protection afforded to this land varies dramatically. Some of the least disturbed areas are protected as wilderness or national parks, but many of these relatively pristine places remain vulnerable to development. The West population is growing fast and becoming increasingly urbanized. Livestock raising and agriculture still have the biggest footprint in the West, but some extractive industries, such as public lands logging, are in decline. Already a major energy producer, the West is home to some key natural gas deposits and the nation's best sites for solar power, but developing these resources can cause significant environmental damage. Thanks for watching this presentation. You can download it and other libraries at EcoWest.org. A number of leading experts on Western conservation serve as advisors to EcoWest. EcoWest is produced by California Environmental Associates. Please feel free to contact us if you have a question or want to make a suggestion.